Welcome to the Professional Pivot. I'm your host, Maggie Ruby, and I would like to thank you all for joining us. Today, we are very excited to bring you episode 1 of a 3-episode podcast series, which we are calling From Side Hustles to a Portfolio Career with RANDALL Kittredge. As we go through our episode, please add questions or comments as you may have, and your opinions matter very much to us, and we will make sure to include in our future episodes. That said, let's dive in. I am very honored to introduce our guest, RANDALL Kittredge. Alex is an entrepreneur, writer, and career strategist who explores what happens when the traditional career ladder stops working. With experience spanning corporate strategy, nonprofit leadership, higher education, and startup consulting, Alex has built himself a portfolio career long before the term portfolio career was even coined. He has advised professionals through organizations like Out for Undergrad, Columbia University, and the Oxford Entrepreneurs Network. I'm also excited to share that Alex has written a new book titled How Your Side Hustles Will Save You, Creating a Durable Career That Transcends the Corporate Ladder. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Maggie. It's great to be here.
So happy you are here. Alex, would you begin by sharing an overview of your book and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. So, How Your Side Hustles Will Save You is not meant to be a hustle culture book. It's really meant to be a structural argument that the single employer career that most folks have known or was known in the past is a historical anomaly. It's not natural law. And the book lands at the right moment. I think if anyone's following the payroll and the jobs numbers, looking at 2025,
Mm.
the economy barely added any jobs, and most recently we lost jobs in the most recent month. I think unemployment has stayed low, but the number of folks that are long-term unemployed in the US is about 1.9 million people. So there's clearly something going on in the economy. And this book is really written for primarily millennials and Gen Z, but really for anyone. It's
Hmm.
very versatile, and it argues that careers are systems. They're meant to be multifaceted, and
Yeah.
uh, you know, when I was studying at Columbia and Cambridge, I learned a lot of frameworks. I was very into systems thinking. And I think the real world pivots that I had that you mentioned between hedge funds, industrials, and startup consulting have really taught me that a career is not a ladder, it's a portfolio.
It's fascinating. And I don't think that, the timing of your book right now could not be more timely and relevant to what everybody is dealing with in the economy today. I have to tell you, I am super excited about reading it, and I hope you will autograph a copy for me so I can proudly put it in my library.
Of
Um,
course.
Terrific. So during our 3 episodes, I would like to weave topics of your book throughout. And today, I would like to begin with unpacking why so many careers feel broken and what replaces them. As we know, for decades, we were promised a simple formula: work hard, climb the ladder, and stability will follow. But for millions of professionals today, that promise really feels broken. Alex, I would love for you to begin with your interpretation of why career disillusionment is not a failure. So with that said, and in today's world, many high performers feel ashamed for being happy in, like, quote unquote good jobs. Why do you think career dissatisfaction feels so personal?
Yeah, well, I think, we were sold a narrative, and you raised this point that if you did well in school, you would get a good job, you would climb the corporate ladder, and then you would retire securely. And I think when that system breaks, unless it's been explained to you properly, you internalize that and you blame yourself. And I think career identity in American culture is deeply tied to your self-worth. Losing a
Hmm.
title or losing a job feels like losing an identity, not just a paycheck. The goal of this book is to reframe that dissatisfaction as a signal. It's a beacon for you. It's a piece of data. It's not a character flaw. And, it means that you've outgrown the model that used to be, and
Hmm.
not that you've failed at it necessarily.
Well, and it's interesting because I think so many people's sense of self has always been tied to, their job, their title, their identity, as such. So that makes a lot of sense. And you write that we're grieving a career model that really no longer exists, as you mentioned. Um, what do you think people are actually grieving?
Yeah, I think folks are grieving the predictability that used to come with a
Mm,
stable career. The idea that your effort would compound in a linear fashion into a security system, promotions, a pension, maybe if you were lucky.
yeah,
They're grieving that community and belonging. The office used to be a social institution, and it's fragmenting. You see that with remote work, but you also see that when some of your work colleagues get laid off at the end of the year. It really fractures that sense of community. And it maps to one of the chapters in the book. I talk about rethinking the timeline of work. And we still
that's
measure
interesting.
careers in the progress of decade long arcs that don't necessarily match the reality of what we're living. I think, if you look at the data as well, white collar employment is down about 2% from the peak that it
Yeah.
reached in 2022. So, the jobs that people plan their lives around are structurally shrinking.
Well, and it's interesting because if you look at just, entry level positions, mid management positions, and senior positions, oftentimes referred to as white collar positions at the top of the house, um, there is a big swing with, fewer and fewer white collar opportunities out there. So, this job market is impacting kind of all layers of an organization, and the arc is very different than it used to be in the past, without question. Um, so, so what emotional patterns do you see that people get stuck in traditional roles, or what we would call traditional roles?
Well, I think there's three main frameworks that folks get stuck in. One is that golden handcuffs paralysis. I
Mm,
think a lot of folks are familiar with it. You're making good money, but you feel trapped in your role. You have a fear of leaving something that's seen as stable and safe, even when it's clearly deteriorating from under you. I think the second is that identity crisis avoidance. So,
yeah,
doubling down on that title because reimagining yourself feels a little bit too scary. And, if you say I'm a VP of X,
yeah,
that becomes a little bit of a security blanket for folks. I think the third one is that comparison spiral. Watching peers or former colleagues get promoted and start businesses, but maybe you feel like you're being left behind. You're not
yeah.
surfing the wave.
Well, and it is interesting because I think you can't help but especially in today's market where everybody is more hypersensitive to just what's going around them. People are more obvious about what is happening to their peers and their colleagues. So I agree with those. Those are three really really good points to keep in mind. So why is it like the old promise of, we talked about this at the top of this, work hard, move up, stay loyal, fails so many people today?
Yeah, well, I think, people are optimizing for status within a shrinking system instead of building
Mm,
options outside of it. If you look at median employee tenure by generational cohort, I do that in the book, and it shows that the younger generations are just moving jobs more frequently, and whether that's because they want to move jobs more frequently or because of these structural changes where the jobs are unstable, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, but I don't think
yeah,
it necessarily matters. Financial services is a big one. You see it every year. Goldman Sachs is famous for doing this, its annual
mm,
cull of the workforce. They've actually seen, I've read recently, they're moving to a quarterly model. So they're doing it more frequently than once a year. So I think it's that precarity. And, you see the leading CEOs at Ford, Amazon, Salesforce, JP Morgan, they've
Yeah.
openly said that white collar jobs are going to disappear. Um, you know, I talk about in the book, there's a chapter on the two models of career architecture. There's that latter model that everyone is really familiar with. And that it assumes that one employer invests in your growth over time. The portfolio model and what I'm arguing for, it stresses that you invest in your own optionality. The promise that the career ladder held, it worked for a specific period in the post
Yeah.
World War II economic boom, probably up until the 90s or maybe into the 2000s. But I think that era is over, and we need to stop teaching it that it's still exists.
So, question for you, just to play off of you talking about, companies, especially you talk about the financial services, really relooking at jobs on a quarterly basis, which is certainly much more rapidly than on an annual basis. Um, are individuals aware of that, and they're anticipating this? I mean, does that put more stress on them about the longevity of how long they'll be with an organization? And why then planning for multiple opportunities, like the portfolio scenario, plays to their advantage if it comes at a drop of a hat and unexpected?
Well, I definitely think so. And I think, part of the reason I wrote this book was to help folks. I think if you're not
Yeah.
already preparing for the future, you might be behind because
Yeah.
the world is moving in this direction. Companies are saying they're going to do this. And if you're not building optionality now through this
Yeah.
portfolio career model, you might find yourself without a job and lacking for options.
Yeah. And then, there's oftentimes, I mean, people are changing jobs more often. You had mentioned even going back where it'd be very rare to see anybody have more than two or three jobs max on their CV. And now it seems like it's so much more prevalent that people are, jumping from job to job. Um, do people even have it? My next question was going to be like, is this burnout really around workload or misalignment? And I don't even know if it's burnout. I mean, are people there long enough to get burned out? But even if they are burned out, is it really about the workload itself, or is it truly about misalignment?
Well, I think there's two things. And I would say, just a data point, about 70 million Americans were doing freelance or gig work in 2025. So that's about 36% of the workforce. And
Yeah,
that's a sizable chunk. That's about one third of the workforce. So,
that's
you
more than
know,
I realized, actually.
yeah, and if that's not burning you out, I think burnout is often misdiagnosed. It's not necessarily too much work, but it's frequently too much work on the wrong things. So, what
Mm,
does that mean? I talk about in the book there's something called the energy versus income matrix, and I think that really becomes essential for folks. If your primary work drains your energy while generating income, you're in what I call the grind quadrant.
mm,
Burnout is almost inevitable. But
okay.
people in aligned work can sustain that effort for years. People in misaligned work burn out in months, regardless of the number of hours they're working. The solution isn't always to do less, it's to restructure what you do so that your energy giving work gets a bigger share of your portfolio.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. That really does. So, if we could shift for a moment and kind of talk a little bit more about the collapse of the career ladder that we
Hmm.
kind of prefaced everything with, what exactly do you mean by the corporate ladder is obsolete? Because I've heard you say that and reference it before. And why is it so important to replace that outdated model?
Yeah, well, I think the latter assumes a vertical single track progression inside one organization. And
Mm,
the model requires employer stability. It requires predictable promotion timelines and long tenures, all of which we're
mm,
seeing disappear in real time. So, the two models of career architecture, the latter, which is linear, employer dependent, and fragile, you have that. And then you have the portfolio model, which is
mm,
diversified, self directed, and more resilient. I think I mentioned it before,
Mm.
but 36% of Americans, about 70 million Americans, doing freelance or gig work in 2025. The shift is already happening. The question is whether you design for it or it just is something that happens to you.
Well, and it's interesting. I think there's a lot more jobs that are posted out there that are fractional or more kind of project related or consultancy type positions than I've ever seen in the past. In fact, most of the time those weren't necessarily posted, and so it sounds like those would be terrific jobs to explore where maybe in the past you haven't, to help build up your own kind of portfolio of skill sets. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think, if you look at the freelance economy across the globe, I've seen an estimate that about over a billion people globally will be freelancing in 2026. I think this isn't necessarily a fringe movement. It's
Wow.
it's sort of the new, I hate to say new normal. We say that a lot these days. It's the new normal.
But that's a staggering statistic. I mean, it really is. I have to kind of put my head around that for a second. Why do you think career progression no longer guarantees career security?
Yeah, well, I think progression within one company is a fragile form of
Mm,
diversification. You're putting all of your eggs in one basket. A single restructuring could wipe out a decade of your effort or your climbing. I think the career risk diversification that I talk about, it goes back to investment portfolio theory. Concentrating in one stock or one employer, it maximizes your upside, but it also maximizes your downside. So, what does that mean? Titles are company specific currencies. Being the SVP of strategy at company X has limited transferability if company X's industry contracts or something cyclical happens in the economy. True security is having transferable skills, a diverse income, and a strong network, and a visible outward reputation. That's what the portfolio model talks about. It's not necessarily promotion. It's required.
yeah. So you hit on something that's kind of a key buzzword for me, transferable skills. And
Hmm.
I guess part of that is that the person interpreting it has to be able to translate transferable skills as opposed to like for like. They've done the same
Hmm.
job with the same title for X number of years, and I quite frankly, I personally think you're going to get more of the same. But I also think then it would be up to the individual to be able to be in a position to strongly articulate how that transferable skill then mirrors and matches what they're looking for in that specific opportunity that you're talking about, I would assume.
Yeah, and I think you see folks moving between industries more these days. I
Mm-hmm.
believe, and I'm not an expert on this, but previously it was very common to stay in a single industry throughout
Yeah.
your entire career. But nowadays, I can use myself as an example. I moved from finance to a startup to
Yeah.
industrials, and now thinking about going back into finance. The walls between these disciplines or these industries are much more porous than they used to be. And I think it's those transferable skills, that signposting that folks give to employers, it helps make them legible when they move industries or move
Mm-hmm.
companies.
And I think a big sell as an individual, when you go from industry sector to industry sector, you really you bring the core, knowledge base with it, but it gives you a fresh set of eyes looking on something. So I think that's also in terms of its deliverables more diversified in terms of thinking and in results. So I think that all plays together. So do you think that technology has truly accelerated this shift?
Well, I do. And, recent research released in March of 2026 from Anthropic shows that white
Mm,
collar roles are predominantly at risk from this AI disruption. It's the computer, math, business, finance, office, or admin roles, legal or management. You know, Per HBR in January, they had some research that came out that said, companies are laying folks off because of AI's potential.
mm-hmm.
It's not even proven that AI can do all of the things that we're thinking it can do yet. We're laying folks off due to the potential that it could. And so,
Yeah.
Fear of disruption is causing real job loss now. I think, I talk about this in the book, that automation paradox. Technology was meant to augment white collar work, but instead it's being used to justify eliminating it. I think, AI related freelance projects, those are up about 60% since 2024. So, that same technology that's displacing jobs is creating new independent work opportunities. So if you think about it, I have some data that says 54% of freelancers report advanced AI skills, and that's compared with,
Yeah.
38% of full-time employees. So the independent workers, or, portfolio careerists, are upskilling faster than folks that are staying inside the corporation.
It was interesting. I was talking to an individual that's currently employed and was talking about how he is working outside trying to stay up on AI skills
Mm,
that he's not exposed to in his current company because he feels that everybody that's outside doing exactly what you were talking about are going to have a leg up on them, and then that makes them in a position that could be jeopardized. So it's a real thing right now.
well, I've seen that too in an organization that I was consulting for. This was in the 2020s, but they were maybe technologically back in the early 2000s. So there were a lot of processes that folks were doing manually or with paper or, Excel, that a computer could do. The computer just didn't do it yet in that organization. So you had folks that their entire job category or their entire role was functionally obsolete outside of that
Mm-hmm.
company. I think if you're not on the lookout for that, if you're just on autopilot, you could
Yeah.
really limit yourself for future opportunities because it's comfortable, it's safe, it's what's always been done. But, your
Yeah.
employer doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart. Actually, fiduciarily, they have their shareholders' interest. It's legally required
Above
for them to.
everything. Right. Well, and just one last thought on the white collar worker aspect of it. I also read this article just recently, and it was talking about with companies are looking not so much for strategists and visionaries. They're looking
Mm,
more for operators,
mhm.
the real doers. And white collar, obvious. I mean, usually strategic advantages are, part of what they bring to the table. They see the big pie in the sky vision that they want to implement, and then they have operators that help do it. And now I think they're looking for white collar workers to do more of the operating component of it, or bring a lot more of that to the table than just a great idea. So
Definitely.
it's fascinating how it shifted. So why do you think job titles are becoming less valuable and skills and a person's reputation are becoming more important?
Well, I think as you see folks move around more frequently, titles are a form of internal currency. They
Mm,
mean different things at different companies. So a director at a startup is not the same as a director at, say, Goldman Sachs.
right.
79% of hiring managers are increasingly relying on these freelancers that we're talking about.
Yeah.
They're building skills, they're delivering outcomes, they're not focusing on titles. And reputation in public, whether it's on LinkedIn, podcasts, published work, or speaking, that's becoming the real resume. I think you're seeing a big focus on storytelling over
Mm-hmm.
titles. And, 45% of high growth public companies use freelancers regularly, the pattern that we were talking about earlier. So, they're buying skills on the market. They're evaluating people on their demonstrated capabilities and not necessarily, credential inflation or title inflation, which I think has been pretty prominent over the last decade. I think finally, the shift that you're talking about is a move from, asking what's your title to what can you do for me? And
Yeah.
that's really what we're seeing.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and I know you and I've had these conversations in the past, but people not relying on senior vice president title, they're putting
Mm,
heads of, because the title means nothing, and you also don't want to present yourself as somebody that's too senior that wouldn't be able to roll up their sleeves and do the job required. So it's just the dynamics are shifting right in front of our eyes so rapidly. So this is a big one, and I think will resonate with a lot of people. What warning signs, if any, can tell somebody that their role might disappear, even if they're a rock star, even if they're a super performer?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think, if your work is increasingly process based and not judgment based, if the core of your job can be reduced to rules, templates, it's automatable. And that's
Mm,
that's the biggest one. I think the second would be if your company is investing heavily in AI or automation tools for your department, that's not necessarily an investment in you, it's an investment in what's coming to replace you. Third, this is a big one. Headcount freezes, if they become permanent in your organization or,
yeah.
last for a long duration, that's a you know that's a sign attrition isn't being backfilled, remaining roles are being consolidated or phased out. That's a sign that you could be at risk. I think if your CEO is publicly talking about replacing jobs with AI, well, that's what they're saying. I think you should probably believe them. I talk about this in the book. There's a navigation skills comparison radar chart, and if your
Interesting.
skills cluster is in one area, you're exposed. But folks with a diversified skill across the portfolio, they stand a better chance.
So, not to say, but back in the day, everybody kind of stayed in a vertical, and their career
Hmm.
progression stayed in one lane. And it seems like being able to jump from vertical to vertical, industry sector to industry sector, even, and possibly getting on, cross-functional projects, anything that you can do to expand, not being put in that cluster that you were talking about, would make a big difference. Do you mind if we kind of, I really want to shift to, because it's one of my favorite topics, the portfolio career. Um, in your, just if you could elaborate in very simple terms, just kind of break down what a portfolio career is in simple terms that is different than freelancing or gig work.
Yeah, I get this one a lot, and it's a great question. I think a portfolio career is a deliberate system of 2 to 4 complementary professional activities that
Okay.
together, provide income, growth, meaning, and a form of security. Freelancing is trading your time for money with maybe multiple clients. It's definitely more it's like an hourly model, I think. It's
Okay.
it's more transactional. And gig work is task based. It's a commodity labor. So maybe I
Okay.
need I need someone that can make a PowerPoint presentation. That's a form of gig work, I think. But a portfolio career is a strategic architecture. It has a formation behind it, and each piece in the portfolio reinforces each other.
So to kind of give it another dimension and kind of way to think about it, the diversification of your career or one's career, would you compare that to like an investment strategy, like having a diversified portfolio? Um, is it similar in any way?
Oh, yeah, you should definitely think about it like a financial portfolio. It's exactly like investing. So, no financial advisor would tell you to put 100% of your money in one stock. It's just irresponsible. But that's really what a single employer career is. I
Yeah.
think, I talk about the career risk diversification in chapter 3. And, you can spread your risk across income streams, across skill areas, and across industries. You use your relationships, your networks. When one contract ends, you sustain your income with another contract, maybe in a complementary industry. We talked about it earlier, but financial services recently lost about 22,000 jobs in a single month, which is quite significant. If your entire career was in financial services with one employer, you're fully exposed to that
Yeah.
disruption. The diversification also creates optionality. So you can move
Yeah.
forward with what's growing, which industries of the economy are growing, and away from what's declining without having to start from zero. The emotional benefit, I think, is underrated as well. if you have multiple income streams, it can reduce anxiety, not increase it. And, you stop catastrophizing about a single point of failure or a single loss.
No, and that helps you shift gears probably rather quickly. Because a lot of times when dramatic things happen in one's career, you dwell on it, and then it also impacts confidence and everything else that goes with it. But if you've got a lot of irons in the fire, things that you can jump on, you can reemphasize, and that probably helps the confidence level stay up, and probably encourages you to do even, better in the next, whatever you're focusing on next, more passion behind it. So one other question I have is this about income, identity, or autonomy?
Yeah, well, I think it's about all three, but in a very specific order. Identity is clarity first. So, who are you beyond your title? I think then it's autonomy. What do you control in your career? And
Yeah,
then third, the income comes as a byproduct of that. So, it's a little bit counterintuitive. Most people start with income because it's urgent. It's very important that you have an income in this economy. But I think, I talk about side hustles, and side hustles are like your career R&D department. Side hustles,
mm,
that are built purely for money without identity alignment lead to that burnout we were talking about earlier. If you
uh,
use that energy income matrix that I talk about in the book, the goal is to, do work that scores high in both income and identity. So, what does that mean? That means that your identity and your autonomy are a path to your income as opposed to working backwards from that. So for
mm,
me, I had a career in intelligence, in finance, and I shifted to consulting and writing.
yeah,
Um, you know, the the identity evolution drove the income optimization, if that makes sense.
yeah.
Autonomy is the ultimate career asset. Everyone is ultimately looking for a form of autonomy. And, people with options negotiate better, they perform better, and oftentimes they stay longer in organizations, but just more frequently on their own terms.
Which is very powerful. Which is very powerful. All right, Alex. So as we wrap up, what would you like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think for anyone that feels like their career is broken, I want them to know that it's not you, it's the model, it's the system. The system changed and, you just haven't updated your operating system yet.
I think that is brilliant advice. And Alex, thank you so much for joining us today and agreeing to be a part of our 3 episode series. Again, what we're titling From Side Hustles to a Portfolio Career with You. Delighted to have you. And as always, you bring so much to the table. Super excited about our next episode. And for everybody that's listening, hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Until next time.